Today we begin part 2 of our weekly series on what the world will look like in the post-COVID-19 era. Amid the virus's pandemic, the world's biggest economies, the United States and China, are waging proxy battles in trade, technology, geopolitical influence and the World Health Organization, bickering over who's to blame for the COVID-19 outbreak. The conflict comes at the worst possible time when global coordination is actually needed for a joint response to beat the virus, stabilise economies as well as develop a working vaccine. So will this rivalry escalate into an all-out Cold War, and will there be a winner, or will it lead to a disaster for all? We discussed this issue with Dr. Mark Shanahan, Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Reading in the UK, and Dr. Peter Rao, the former Director of Research in the Office of George W. Bush and a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. My first question to you, Dr. Shanahan. The rivalry between the United States and China, well, we've seen it take place at the World Health Organization's annual summit. Why do you think the two countries are choosing to wage this battle now?
Different reasons. If you look at the United States, of course, it's election year, and Donald Trump is doing everything he can to deflect from a less than stellar performance in dealing with the pandemic within the United States. So Trump's natural tactic is to find somebody else to blame for any fault. No fault is his. It has to be laid off to somewhere else. And China is a pretty easy target in this sense, and he is going for it. His natural tendency is to look to blame someone. He's called this the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, and he's blaming China for not closing it down quickly. And alongside that, of course, he's blamed the World Health Organization, which is the United Nations agency, for siding with China. Now, if you look at the Chinese side, Xi has to carry a fair amount of blame for creating the culture that stopped local officials in Wuhan from speaking up and reporting just how bad the outbreak was very early, when it could have been contained within China. But Xi has two aims, I would say. One is a foreign policy aim, the other one for the audience at home. There's a rather nasty strain of nationalism that has emerged out of China's time with the virus, and he's playing to that. On the foreign policy side, he's seeing America ease back from international involvement, and he's filling that space, looking even at supporting public health in developing countries to improve and raise Chinese influence.
And Dr. Rao, would you agree with this point of view? Why do you think President Trump and also Chinese President Xi Jinping are so eager to point the finger? I mean, what are they both aiming to gain from this blame game?
Well, I think it's understandable that it's not always easy to follow the daily ebbs and flows of presidential rhetoric. But I do think one thing is clear, and that is that the President Trump in this case, is genuinely incensed with the Chinese for, to put it charitably, being less than honest with the world, the international community at the very outset of this crisis. Had they then alerted the international community to what they knew, we would have gained not only time to prepare for this crisis, but also understanding of what we were facing. Because we didn't, so the administration would argue, the global economy has tanked and we face a public health emergency in the United States, but really across the industrialized world and soon in the global South. As for the Chinese attitude, I do think there is a bit of a psychological projection going on where the sins of their own leadership are being projected onto the United States. There have been some very clever statements to that effect. But secondly, I think it's also a pattern of Chinese diplomacy. The Chinese have mastered the vernacular of what the West deems to be multilateral diplomacy, and they're very effective at deploying that language. When, however, they are called out for behavior that doesn't match that rhetoric, they can be quite acidic and really respond with aggressive rhetoric. And so I think we've seen Chinese diplomats around the world act very aggressive to push back on a narrative that has taken hold that the Chinese do have some blame and have some guilt in the nature of the crisis that we're facing.
And Dr. Rao, with the recent souring of relations, it seems that the US and China's trade war is back on. And many observers do seem to agree that a decoupling of the two economies is not easy to pull off, and another prolonged trade dispute won't benefit either side. But this time around, rather than the usual tariff tactic, the US seems to be lashing out against China's tech sector. So how important is it for both countries to secure technological leadership, and how do you expect this specific battle to unfold?
Well, technological leadership, the advances in the modern technologies really is the game. That is what it's all about. And whoever masters the technologies of today and tomorrow will probably be the dominant power in the coming decades and control, to a large part, shape of the future of the 21st century. There really isn't a policy consensus yet in Washington. We're at a very early stage. Before the pandemic hit, the administration already had taken a tough line against the Chinese. I suspect now a consensus will form that will accelerate and intensify that attitude. But how to pull this off is very difficult because unlike during the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union had different separate economic spheres, China and the US are interlinked. And so it's difficult to pull away without doing a great deal of damage to your own economy. In the end, I suspect we will want to sustain large trading volumes with the Chinese, but attempt to rope off and proscribe certain technological sectors where we think the Chinese are liable to steal, to thieve, to force transfers, among other activities they've been known to undertake in the last several years to steal technology from the West. So to sum it up, I think if the Americans have their druthers, if the Americans have their say, it's continue trade with the Chinese, but carefully prescribe certain essential sectors.
Well, the US has been telling European countries not to use Chinese 5G, for instance. And Dr. Shanahan, many countries, like European nations, they've been caught in the crossfire of this conflict between China and the US. And European nations in particular, they have been strong allies of the US in the past. But with the Trump administration focusing on America first, do you think loyalties have been shifting in recent years?
I wouldn't say that loyalties have been shifting towards China. There is still a significant suspicion, and there is still a natural transatlanticism among much of Europe. But there is some great disquiet with the Trump administration. Trump does not like multilateral organizations, does not like working with the EU, for instance, and much prefers to have that kind of bilateral conversation that is pretty much zero-sum in the way it works. There has to be a winner, and that has to be Trump. Now, if you look at China, China presents both an opportunity and a threat. And Xi has been quite clever in picking off European leaders individually, trying to flatter them, trying to work with them, people like Viktor Orban in Hungary. And there is a sense that Europe is a little bit fractured at the moment, and he may get some success in that. You also have nations like the United Kingdom, which is pushing hard for a trade deal with the United States at the moment, which is by no means guaranteed. Could they be flattered into a stronger relationship with China? Possibly, but that goes against 240 years of history. China has some way to go to make inroads to really threaten the kind of long-standing relationships that European countries have had with the United States.
Well, Dr. Rao, throughout this pandemic, China has been touting its own version of globalization, the benefits of modern authoritarianism, and it's been highlighting its rapid economic growth and social cohesion as well. And what is it? What is this world order that China envisions, and what do you think its game plan is amid this pandemic?
Well, call me old-fashioned, but I still think America is something of a benevolent superpower, which is to say the system that the United States helped stand up in the aftermath of World War II is one that is somewhat horizontal, a series of sovereign states who are treated under the precepts of international law equally. To the extent possible, there's been little intervention in the affairs of other states, and we've hoped and tried and attempted to advance a liberal democratic system. So if the U.S. System has been relatively horizontal, I think the Chinese, by contrast, believe in a bit more of a vertical system, where the Chinese are on top and states and countries around the world are categorized by levels of supplicants to the extent that they're willing to work through and by and to the Chinese rather than alongside them. So I think if the United States, as a liberal democratic power, its character shines outwards and radiates outwards into the type of system it attempted to organize, the Chinese, as an authoritarian system, will surely have those features carry through to the extent that they establish an order. And one can already see that in parts and regions of the world where the Chinese have been active.
And Dr. Shanahan, so China's bold claims and accusations against the United States and, as you mentioned, its eagerness to come to Europe's rescue during this pandemic, it has caused some wariness. Do you think this will cause European countries to rethink their ties with China? And also, how do you think countries stuck in the middle, kind of like South Korea, should react to this conflict?
There's a very healthy level of suspicion around. China talks some sweet talk quite a lot of the time, but its actions don't really tend to match that talk. I think we have to understand in the West far better what China's overall foreign policy goals are. Is it just to be a regional hegemon? Is it just to be the undisputed leader in Asia, which obviously then does have an impact on South Korea, on Japan, on other countries around there? Or is it going for some global superpower status? And if it is the latter, then it has to win over those Asian nations around it. And in order to do that, it's going to have to clean up its act economically. It's going to have to clean up its act around intellectual property, around cybersecurity, and most of all around human rights. At the moment, China rises because of economic power. We need to see that matched, very much like my colleague was saying earlier on, by playing a full role in the liberal world order that is beneficial globally and is not just striking out against other countries to ensure China's dominance.
And Dr. Rao, speaking of this, regionalism in Asia, Dr. Rao, China's recent movements in the South China Sea has also drawn some concern, and the US has also reacted, scaling up its naval activities there. And also tensions are flaring over Taiwan. Do you think either side is prepared to turn this into an all-out Cold War, or do you think they'll eventually have to put their differences aside?
That's a very difficult question. Thus far, the US has run a series of naval operations to ensure the freedom of the seas, and those have been considered robust measures to push back on Chinese violations of international law and Chinese infringement of the territorial waters of Southeast Asia's countries. But it really hasn't had much of an effect. So China continues to press forward. It continues to act in ways that have angered and upset individual countries in Southeast Asia, that has gone against the rulings of international courts. But at some point, it will butt up against red lines. Where those red lines for the Americans lie, I think is difficult to say. One is certainly Taiwan, and that is something that is on China's radar. But at some point, the U.S. will have to defend its alliance system in Asia, and China will dance its way towards those red lines, and we'll then see how we proceed.
So we'll continue to see this deterrence in Asia. Well, finally, before we go, Dr. Shanahan, in the meantime, it does seem that other countries in the global community, they're becoming very exasperated by this ongoing conflict between the two powers. So do you think this could possibly be a chance for the global community to build a new multipolar world order?
Oh, it's an interesting one to see. We're a long way on from the Nixon and Mao days. We're a long way on from Eisenhower and Taiwan back in the 50s. America may be in relative decline at the moment. China is certainly on the economic rise, but is going to be scarred horribly by this pandemic. And it may well be that the United States rises quicker from that and returns to its unipolarity at the head of the world. But we're in a very different place from the old Cold War. The economies of China, of the United States, of the European Union, of other major trading nations are all intertwined. They've got to find a way to work together. There are many institutions working towards some kind of peaceful coexistence. When it comes down to it, these major powers need each other.
Well, that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. It's been a very insightful discussion. Dr. Mark Shanahan of the University of Reading and Dr. Peter Rao at the Hudson Institute. Thank you very much for joining the programme.
Thanks for having me.
This is also where we wrap up the show. Thank you for watching, and we hope you join us at the same time tomorrow for more global insights on issues making headlines. Have a great day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.